Hi, my name is Tony Kirumba, and for the last 3.5 years I have been working as a Salesforce consultant and developer. This video is a part of my portfolio where I can showcase my skills, my expertise, and show you what it looks like for me to realize a project on the Force.com platform. I've put together a little something that I'm calling my Salesforce Cookbook Project. I'd like to give you the background of this project, show you the driving thought behind it, and then get into the details and demonstrate it for you. Talk some technology, talk some design, and talk about some of the code I've built, and then wrap it all up in a nice little bow and share some of what I've learned in the process of putting this all together. The video that you're watching is going to show up right here on my portfolio website, MapleForce Developer Edition. And all of the details about the project, all of the write-up, all of the diagrams and the GitHub repository are in the links adjacent. So, my Salesforce Cookbook project, what is it all about? Well, I always intend to eat healthy, but like many people I imagine, I struggle to do it in a consistent way. So I wanted to put together a little project that spoke to that aspect of my personality and something that I could realize entirely within Salesforce. Imagine that you run a test kitchen a la Bon Appetit. If you're not familiar with their content, it is fantastic. Definitely check them out. Or you just want to be more conscious about what goes on in your kitchen. You, a kitchen manager, need to efficiently keep track of your kitchen resources and activities in order to make well-informed purchasing decisions. And that is the need statement that formed the basis of this entire project. The project itself is a solution that would enable you to catalog recipes, track the usage of kitchen items, ingredients across your recipes, and track the frequency of cooking actions across recipes. How many times did I sear this? How many times did I mix that? How many times did I wash this? The project itself is a database, objects and records, with some Lightning Web components and some Apex on top to do some interesting things for user entry and text parsing, and then visualizing the data using standard Salesforce reporting and dashboard features. But before we get into depth, with this project purpose of enabling you, the user, the stakeholder, to catalog recipes, track usage of resources, ingredients, and activities, I first took that and turned it into some reporting requirements, some questions that this system and the data within it should answer. Specifically, what ingredients and steps does a recipe consist of? So we're taking a recipe and we're identifying some key entities, ingredients and recipes. How many times does an item appear across recipes? Is this something that I should keep in stock or buy as needed? How many times does a particular cooking action take place across recipes? Is this something that I should invest in a specialized tool for, like a mixer? Or do I have a specialized tool that is not getting any use because none of my recipes use it? So going from the need statement to the project purpose, identifying some reporting requirements, and the answers to those reporting requirements then feed right back into our need statement. So with all of that, let's look at the project. The starting point of the project was a entity relationship diagram where I sort of listed out what are the key entities that make up this project and how do they relate to each other. I used Lucidchart with the Salesforce Architecture Gallery, with a template from the Salesforce Architecture Gallery that sort of gives you a way to list out different kinds of entities and then list out different kinds of relationships in a meaningful way so that you can do your design. And here is the design of this project as a whole. We have cookbooks, which have a many-to-one relationship enabled through a junction object with recipes. Recipe is sort of our key, our focal object. And we know that recipes are made up of ingredients and recipe steps. Now those ingredients are made up of a kitchen item, salt, and a measure, tablespoon. Whereas our recipes consist of cooking actions, and we again have a many-to-one relationship there. Something worth noting, within our entity, there are sub-entities, and one of the models that the Architecture Gallery uses to define these is record types, of course. If you have an object, then you can use record types to define sub-entities, where the object represents the entire entity. And then they also have this concept of conceptual entities, where it doesn't fit neatly into the category of record types. Taking a look at measure, zoom in there. You can see that in my design, a measure can be either a solid measure or a liquid measure. And if it's a solid measure, then it can be discrete or continuous. If it's a liquid measure, it can be continuous. Think you can have a cup of water, but you can't have a unit of water or 5 waters. And so I set up this idea, this conceptual idea of measures that can be solid or liquid with that in between, and then realize this using a dependent pick list, where solid liquid is the controlling pick list, and then discrete continuous is the controlled pick list. So that's the design. This design diagram is available on the project. Please go have a look at it. Once I had used this to workshop and brainstorm the ideas and figure out how everything worked, then it was time to jump into Salesforce and realize that design in my schema. Currently, these are the only custom objects in my org, so if I go ahead and add all of the custom objects here, and zoom and auto layout, zoom all the way out, then we see objects and relationships to realize my design diagram. With my cookbook over here, recipe, our focal object, with a lookup to ingredient and a lookup to recipe steps. Ingredients have that master detail relationship with kitchen item and with measure, and then recipe steps have that many-to-many with cooking actions. So we've gone from idea to reporting requirements to design to schema. Now we have objects that we can make some useful data out of. The way that we're going to look at that is internally within my Salesforce dev environment, and then externally on my Experience Cloud site, where you as a user can go in and interact with this yourself. So we've set up our schema. Let's create a recipe and try to drive and use one of the small applications that I built to pick out some of that useful data from it. So under the recipes tab, you can see I already have a handful of recipes. Let's make a new one. Let's say that I'm going to make a beef steak. So let's say we want to make a beef steak recipe. Now my beef steak recipe is going to entail some ingredients. Obviously, let's say a pound of beef. I don't have a measure called pound, so I'm going to go ahead and make that measure now. Move me over to the right. Going to make a new measure called pound of beef. Looks like we don't have a item called beef either, so we're going to make it as well. Just say this is an edible item. So you can see edible, non-edible are record types that were listed out in the design diagram of beef. Good to eat. And then let's add one more ingredient that I have created some records previously for. Say we have a tablespoon. Look at that, tablespoon is already a measure that I've created before of salt, which again is also an ingredient that I've used before. And I will create some recipe steps. I've written a little program, a trigger and a trigger handler, so that when I enter my recipe steps, my program is going to go through this step summary, pick out any cooking actions that I've already cataloged, and then count those cooking actions, create cooking action on recipe records for those. So let's see, the first thing I'm going to do is sear, here, mix beef with salt. And the second thing I'm going to do is sear the beef. Now mix and sear are cooking actions that I've cataloged before. So if I go into this recipe, if I go into that recipe step of sear the beef, then I can see there's a cooking action that's been cataloged sear. And if I look at that cooking action, then I see that the cooking action of sear takes place across 5 recipes. And so now I know, oh, I'm searing across 5 recipes. This might be a good reason to invest in a flamethrower. So that gives you a brief overview of the objects and how they're being used, and a little program that's doing some useful work to drive our data goals there. On top of this, the exciting thing that I wanted to build is I wanted to put this all together in a way that allows users to very naturally create recipes while using some interesting techniques and programs to pull all of the meaningful data out of there. And that is the recipe quick entry wizard that you can see on the portfolio page. To give you a little bit of overview here, again, the purpose of this particular application is to allow the user to naturally enter recipes while using the Lightning Web components, the Apex classes, and a little bit of tooling to draw out the data that's meaningful to us. In order to use this, I'm actually going to start from my home page. And you'll see on my home page that I've given guests a login that they can use in order to access the site as an authenticated user and get the full experience. Guest user at Mapleforce 1 exclamation. So that's a particular guest user that I've locked down so that you can access the experience site fully without compromising my org. So now that we're logged in as a guest user and we can interact fully with the site, I can go ahead and go to my interactive projects, open up my Salesforce Cookbook tab, and give the recipe quick entry wizard a shot. Test it by entering an ingredient in any of the following formats. So you can see I've done some programming to enable the user to enter their recipes in a very natural way, whether they want to say just the name of the ingredient, whether they want to use words instead of numbers, and whether they want to, and making measures optional. So let's give this a shot. Same one that we did before. Let's say test recipe. Recipe serving size of 5. And here I can now list out my ingredients. So just like we did before, 1 pound of beef. Actually, let's go down the list. Let's say I have beef. I have 1 cucumber. 1 turns into 1 a number. I have 1 tablespoon of salt. I have 1 tablespoon of salt. I have a lime. And I have just a cup of Worcestershire. No idea how to spell Worcestershire. All right, so I can see that whatever format I enter my ingredients in, they are parsed into a discrete quantity, unit, and measure. Quantity, measure, and item. So I can go ahead and save that recipe. And I get a nice little toast event. And now here on my little dashboard component, if I go ahead and refresh my dashboard, I should see those items get cataloged in my count ingredients by item. So one of the reporting requirements we had is how many times does an item appear across recipes. This dashboard component visualizes that data so that I can make decisions about it. Aha. So we have Worcestershire, beef, etc., all of which have been created today. And so that gives you a sense of how we could go from an idea to pinning down the idea to some specific data that we want to derive from our system, and then building the system in relation to building the system to target that data, and building our tools, our apps, our visualizations to get to the point where we have meaningful data that we can make good decisions about. I would like to talk technology and go into some technical detail of how especially the Lightning Web Components and the Apex came together. If that is not your wheelhouse, then skip ahead to the summary portion of the video. You'll see a timestamp below, and I'll share with you just a summary of the project as a whole and what I learned putting this all together. Let's talk technology. So you've had a sense of, you've had a demo of the recipe quick entry application. Again, the purpose, the value of this application is providing an easy, natural way for users to enter information while using our logic, using our program to draw out the meaningful entities from our data so that we can get to the goal, which is well-informed purchasing decisions, and this is the information that would support them. Putting together the recipe quick entry wizard, so this is all built using Lightning Web Components, which I will show you shortly and which you can all find in my GitHub repository. Link to that right up here. Was a very interesting project, and there was a number of specific challenges that I thought would be interesting to discuss on video. The first one being using how to parse words into numbers. I went back and forth on that and ultimately ended up using an external integration, an external API. So I'm calling a words to numbers API and returning that information. Communicating across components. This ingredient list is a distinct component, and there's some interesting logic that is happening between the way that events and properties are passed down from the parent, the recipe quick entry, down to the table. The apex and passing in objects and returning objects from to or from between LWC and apex. And then finally, HTML libraries. So this, something that I didn't show before, is that this table is actually reorderable. You can reorder the items on it. And all of that is effected using some neat HTML that I was able to pull into my component. So let's take a look at the code and talk about it. First thing I'd like to discuss is the API. It's a relatively simple implementation. You could see here that in my recipe entry wizard, LWC, I have a handle recipe change event. There we go, handle add row event. Where when the enter key is pressed on this particular input field, then that fires an event which passes the input string to Apex, returns that from Apex, and then passes it into the table so that it can be rendered. So we have an Apex class here, parse ingredient input, that is having the event target value passed in. And if I go over to that controller, my recipe entry wizard controller, then the logic of this class is to identify what the content of that input string is, and then where a number is identified as part of the, where a word representation of a number like 1 or 12 TWELVE is identified, pass that to the words to numbers API and return the number format of that. So let's do an example here. Let's say 12 oranges. And let's actually refresh everything. One of the things I have not been able to figure out is how to refresh the component when I hit save. It works internally, it works on the internal application, but my window.reload function JavaScript does not work on the Experience Cloud site. So let's say I have 12 oranges. I entered the word 12. That got passed in to my parse ingredients. That got passed into my parse ingredient input, was received by parse ingredient input. Where are you? And then was processed and was ultimately parsed by quantity and item, 12 oranges. 12 oranges tried to pull the decimal value of 12 out, and that decimal value, when it failed to find a decimal value because we didn't enter the number 12, then we did a call using the words to numbers class. That words to numbers class, very simply, that's the meta. That words to numbers class very simply takes in a string, makes a request, gets the response, and then passes that back. And so, to give you a little bit of the backstory here, I knew that I needed to have this feature of converting words to numbers. The initial step was, can I do this in Apex? Is there an Apex library that someone has built that will allow me to pass in a word and get back a number? I did not find one. The next step, since I'm using an LWC, was, is there a JavaScript library that I can incorporate that will do this for me? I did find a JavaScript library, but the implementation of the JavaScript library, if you've worked with LWC, if you've worked with third parties, I'm sure you know, it's a little bit tricky to get everything to play happily together. And so I did have a words to numbers JavaScript library, but I could never figure out how to get the callbacks to render correctly and be able to call the methods of my third party library. And so we escalate to the third level, which is send the data out, let someone else deal with the problem. And that worked fantastically. So now we have an Apex class that makes a call out, gets me back what I need, and I can pass that back to the Apex, pass that back to the LWC. The next interesting thing that I wanted to talk about, and I think this was the most interesting part of the entire project, is communicating back and forth across the components. So the ingredients table is being held here. Here, let me enter a couple of items. Let's say 1 cup of sugar. The recipe quick entry wizard, that Lightning Web component, does not retain this list. This list only exists within the context of the child component, the ingredient list. And so because it's a property of the child component, but I can't pass it up as a property, when I want to save my record, what I'm actually doing is taking this information and then calling an event in the child component. So the event to save is in the child component. I'm calling it from the parent component and then passing in the information that is in the child component, so that in the parent, so that parent passes information and calls a method in the child. Child takes the information from the parent, puts it together with the information, with the data that it's currently holding, and then executes. If successful, show the toast event and pass that event, pass the success or fail event back up to the parent. You can see some of that here in the HTML of the parent component. When the child component is called, we have an on-success and on-fail event. So if an on-success or on-fail event is registered in the child component, then we have methods to handle that in the parent. When I want to save a recipe, I'm clicking that button and executing a method on the parent component. That method on the parent component, handle save recipe, is calling the insert recipe function on the child component and passing in its data, the recipe. In the child component, that insert recipe function, which is tagged API so that I can call it from the parent, is using the recipe that's been passed in, the list of ingredients that it currently holds, and then executing the Apex insert recipe to create that record. And if it's successful, dispatching a success event. That success event is then caught by the parent component and handled to display the toast event. To say a little bit about that, one of the key issues was I'm doing a lot of communicating back and forth. Sometimes I need to call events where I would have preferred to pass down properties. And there was a lot of what is the trade-off of one versus the other? How am I using one versus the other? So the real design work was in deciding when to pass down properties versus when to call events. And then from the child up to the parent is very simple. You can only pass up an event. Those events are, in and of themselves, are particularly interesting because I'm passing in objects, and there's some detail as to how to pass an object from an LWC to Apex. Obviously, different programming languages, different architectures. And so I think I ended up using a JSON.serialize. So just serialize the project in LWC and then deserialize it in the Apex. Finally, the HTML library. So if you look at the ingredients table HTML, what you find is that it's using a lot of standard HTML components and then has some particular JavaScript functions that allow me to drag and drop. And so one of the real really powerful things about LWC, and one of the reasons why I want to get good with it, is because you have all of the power of modern web development, modern HTML that you can now apply. This component in particular is a drag and drop table that I then customized into my ingredients table. To wrap up sort of the technical discussion, the components were a lot of fun to build. It is very clear to me that LWC is the future of development on the Salesforce platform. Again, because you have all of the power of modern web development at your fingertips that you can now apply to your Salesforce solutions. What came up over and over again is that the foundation of reporting requirements and a clear view of what data are we trying to pull out and make valuable for our users allowed me to expand the scope of the applications without compromising them. I've worked in environments and had projects before where every time we want to add a new feature, we are compromising the foundation of the application and the program as a whole. Here, because we had taken the time to figure out what is important, what do we want to get out by the end of it, we then have the leeway to expand our functions and expand the scope of our applications while still clearly and definitively meeting that need. Sum up, the story of my Salesforce Cookbook application that I would love for you to go and take a look at and play with and give me feedback on is one of sitting down and coming up with a problem that was meaningful and relevant to me, using proper consulting frameworks to narrow it down into a discrete need statement and then a solution that I wanted to build out of that. I want to efficiently keep track of my kitchen resources, so I'm going to build something that lets me catalog, that lets me track items, that lets me track activities. And then going from that purpose to my reporting requirements, I'm going to build a system. What questions is this system going to answer? It's going to tell me what ingredients and steps my recipes are composed of. It's going to tell me how many times items show up. It's going to tell me how many times cooking actions show up. And then taking those reporting requirements and using them to brainstorm the design of a database and my entity relationships. Going from those entity relationships to a schema in Salesforce, and finally to an application in Salesforce, a fully featured application in Salesforce. And then once we have a base application, then going the extra mile to design some interesting Lightning Web components. I'll zoom out a little bit. I didn't show this during the technical discussion, but these are just a high-level design diagram of the two Lightning Web components and the Apex, and then the external API that we're calling and how everything fits together. So now that we formed a basis, being able to layer on top of it by building, for example, a quick entry wizard that uses Lightning Web components and Apex to allow the user to naturally enter recipes while still meaningfully pulling out the data that is valuable to us. And that's the arc of this. Thank you again for checking on my portfolio and taking the time to listen to a discussion of it. The key takeaway for me in the process of putting this all together is I came in thinking that I was going to showcase my Salesforce expertise. And what ended up happening is I had to showcase my consulting chops and my ability to narrow my scope and find a focus and then build to that focus before I could have a successful project. There was a lot of going around in circles and then finally stopping and stepping away from Salesforce back to what am I trying to do, and then using Salesforce as my tool of choice to implement that. And in my experience, that's what every great Salesforce implementation comes down to. It is a good consulting experience of narrowing focus, defining scope, and defining solution, and then using Salesforce and all of its tools and all of its power as the platform to make it all happen. Thank you again for checking out my video. Please do give me feedback, give me your thoughts, or let's talk about opportunities. You can find my LinkedIn or my email in the description of this video, and you can also find it by going to the Contact Me tab, where you can either leave me a message in Salesforce or connect with me directly. Cheers.